Once upon a time, there were uncommon cards that would approach the $10 to $15 mark where they hadn't been reprinted in a hot minute. The famous ones for me, or the ones that stand out for me, were Remand and Inquisition of Kozilek. Kozilek were printed for quite some time, but were seeing play in modern and older formats too, like Legacy, and those cards then began to demand a price tag. And some cards, in spite of getting literally a dozen reprints a year, like Path to Exile, still hover around the dollar mark because they're so widely played across, again, older formats and Commander. Lightning Greaves is a $5 card in spite of it getting reprinted every single year in the precons. If they skipped a year of it being reprinted, I think the price would actually climb significantly. But the driving force for those prices tend to be the older formats. They tend to be the formats like Modern or Legacy or Commander. And today's example from Aetherdrift is actually one that is seeing huge amounts of play in Standard, but also goes all the way back to Vintage, making it an absolute powerhouse. An example of perhaps power creep that has led to a $4, almost $5 uncommon in the current imprint last released Standard set. This is Stock Up, a 3-mana sorcery in blue that says look at the top 5 cards of your library, put 2 of them into your hand and the rest in the bottom of your library in any order. To the uninitiated or to the more casual player, it sounds like a reasonable card selection spell, but rather unexciting. You tend to get with newer Commander players, they don't want to play cards that just draw you a couple cards or look for a couple cards unless they're literally tutoring. It's so good at what it does. It's seeing play in several Standard decks, not in every single build of Esper Pixie, for example, but there are people putting up finishes you can find on Goldfish that are playing several copies of this card. But further to that, it's also seeing play in Modern. Again, it's not in every single Grinding Station deck, but this 5-3 finish at the SEA Championship Final shows someone playing 2 copies of it in their Grinding Breach deck, a deck that I assume will get neutered and or banned out of the format soon, as it's quite oppressive. But then we go back to Vintage, where only the most powerful cards get played. Vintage is every single card in Magic's history with a very finite ban list, like a very, very small ban list, and then everything else is restricted. Black Lotus, your Lurises, your Okos, everything that was a serious design mistake that ruined Legacy or Modern or even Standard is playable in Vintage. And in that format, people are playing 4 copies of this, primarily in the Luris PO decks, the Paradoxical Outcome decks. It hasn't seen huge adoption from the other like big blue deck in the format, which is the Bug or Sultai mid-range decks. My assumption there is that because this card is good at finding 2 particular cards or finding parts of a combo. The Luris PO deck, one of its win conditions is to Time Vault you out of the game, where you assemble Time Vault plus one of the multiple keys that they play, and those keys allow you to untap Time Vault, and thus you're winning through a combo. It also allows you to dig specifically for PO, the Paradoxical Outcome, the draw engine of the deck. Meanwhile, the Bug sort of builds, the Sultai mid-range builds, are trying to play 1-for-1 removal and 1-for-1 counterspell while protecting their threats, which in this case are Psychic Frogs and Okos and things like that. And thus they aren't looking for specific things to do the combo, the Paradoxical Outcomes or the Time Vaults. The reason I bring all of this up is A, I was playing a bit of Vintage last week to prep for the MTGO creator event that ran, where I went 0-2 and dropped. Didn't do too well in that, but I guess I wasn't very practiced at Vintage. But also to highlight just how good this card is compared to anything else that's come in the past. Classically, 3-mana sorcery speed, draw 2 cards is Divination, and it's largely unplayable in every format that it's printed into except for Limited. Stock Up is so significantly better because it looks 5 cards deep. You get to see 5 cards instead of 2, and you have to put 2 of them into your hand. This makes it more akin to an Anticipate. Anticipate is obviously 2 mana, looks at top 3, puts 1 of them into your hand, and is instant speed so you can hold up interaction while holding it. This card saw a reasonable amount of play when it came to Standard through Khans of Tarkir originally. I don't think it saw much play when it came through with Ikoria though. But Anticipate simply replaces itself. It gives you 1 card to replace the card you are casting, and thus it gives you card selection but no card advantage. Stock Up is replacing itself and giving you another card, whilst looking an entire 5 cards deep, and thus it's giving you selection to a strong degree whilst also giving you card advantage. If we looked at previous cards like Fact or Fiction, a 4-mana instant that reveals top 5 cards of your library, and opponent separates them to 2 piles and you get to pick 1, usually you're getting 2 or 3 cards out of Fact or Fiction, but you're not necessarily getting the exact combo that you want. It is 1 mana more, and it is playable in your opponent's end step after holding up interactions, so it serves a different role. And Fact or Fiction was a powerhouse back in the day, like quite a long time ago when it was printed originally in Invasion. It was in top 8 decks in the World Championships back in 2001 and 2002, for example. But since being printed into Modern through Modern Horizons, it has seen a small amount of fringe play. hardly any play at all. It's just not that good by today's standards. There is an arguably power-crept, slightly better version of Fact or Fiction in Lord of the Rings that has seen, again, some fringe play in some of the blue-black mid-range decks of Modern. Sauron's Ransom says 3 mana, choose an opponent. They look at the top 4 cards of your library, separate them into a face-down pile and a face-up pile, and you pick one. And then the ring tempts you as well on top of all of that. Essentially, it's Fact or Fiction, but half of the pile or one of the piles is blind. Stock Up removes all of this fucking around with your opponent. It gives you 2 cards out of the top 5, and then you get to just move on with your life. Of course, it's sorcery speed compared to instant. If this card was instant, I think it might be one of the best card draw spells ever printed. And it's currently sorcery speed, and seeing as a player as a 4 of vintage decks, which might suggest it already is one of the best card draw spells ever printed. I missed it during previous season. I saw some pros mention how good this seemed, but I just sort of brushed it off as, yeah, sure, good enough for standard. I did not expect to walk into some vintage leagues and see people casting, 1 of 4 copies of these. And it's pretty neat because they just have 2 uncommons like this. This is the one that's seeing huge amounts of play in, fringes of Modern and regularly in Legacy. Meanwhile, Momentum Breaker is not really above $1 right now, but it is a card seeing quite a large amount of standard play due to it being an enchantment that can be flickered with Pixie. And it's also seeing some play, again, in the PO decks that can use Momentum Breaker as a spell that they can reset later on with Paradoxical Outcome to put it back to hand to cast again. Momentum Breaker is a 2-mana enchantment that says start your engines, which is largely irrelevant to the card, but it is extra value. And when this enchantment enters, each opponent sacrifices a creature or vehicle of their choice. Each opponent who can't discards a card, and it has 2 mana, sacrifice the enchantment to gain life equal to your speed. It is comparable to Edicts of old, namely, or more recently, the most power-crept version of an Edict is probably Sheoldred's Edict. Now, importantly, the reason that Sheoldred's Edict became so prominently played across many formats is the modal element of it. Not only does it allow you to hit a Planeswalker where necessary, which is a huge boon in some formats, but it allows you to pick non-token or token creature, and thus you can hit the big germ attached to their living weapon, their Caldra, for example, or you can choose to hit, if they've got a token and play like a 1/1, you can hit the actual factual creature sat besides it. Traditionally, when you're edicting someone, a 1/1 token is insurance against an edict. Famously, people would crack a fetch to get Dryad Arbor to save their Marit Lage from an edict in Legacy. I mean, that doesn't stop Sheoldred's Edict here, which is interesting, sideboard, an interesting side pattern play sort of element to it. But I just think it's interesting that Edict managed to give us so much extra utility and power creep out old edicts. So how come Sheoldred's Edict seeing very little vintage play, a bit of Legacy play, but Momentum Breaker is seeing play? Well, it's the permanent element of Momentum Breaker. We should also not fail to acknowledge the fact that this says if the opponent can't sack a creature, they discard a card, and thus this is never a dead card in any matchup where creatures are further between, or non-existent. Usually your removal rots in hand against some control decks, but Momentum Breaker being played and recurred, flickered, played out of the graveyard, bounced back to hand and replayed, all of those things allow it to make your opponent discard cards and create card advantage through it as well. That's quite an important element to this puzzle. Sheoldred's Edict is more powerful in some ways because it's instant speed. Meanwhile, this sorcery version can be recurred with Paradoxical Outcome, can be flickered in any sort of flicker deck. Black-White Flicker in Modern isn't really playing this, but it could if it wanted to. Esper Pixie, for example. And then, of course, there's the interaction with Lurrus. Lurrus makes anything that's permanent based in 2 CMC or less much more powerful. And thus, if this ends up in your graveyard through some sort of interaction like hand attack or counter spells, you can replay it later on via Lurrus. You can even sack it to its own thing to gain life equal to your speed, which may only be a little bit of life, but it's still some upside. What I think is really interesting when comparing Stock Up to Sauron's Ransom, when comparing Momentum Breaker to Sheoldred's Edict, is that we're seeing, I'm calling it power creep because these cards are, evidently seeing play in decks that are going X and 1 in vintage challenges and similar, showing their pure power level, but it's super fascinating to see the power creep be on a sorcery version of the card, and thus we see sorcery versions of the card being alternatives to the instant speed ones, which traditionally, if you were assessing a card, you would assume the instant speed one is better. It's so fascinating to see that through the interactions with other parts of the deck, actually the sorcery speed ones can be better. Or in the case of Stock Up, it's just raw dog solid to look at 5 and pick 2, even at sorcery speed. I like the fact that there are sorcery speed cards that are cropping up as better alternatives to previously played cards. I think that's really neat from a design perspective. The argument can be made that this isn't actually power creep, that Momentum Breaker and Sheoldred's Edict are both some of the most powerful Edict style effects we've ever seen, but one has the advantage of being a permanent index that synergizes with it, and also has this added value of making the opponent discard if they haven't got a creature, and gives you that little bit of life gain perhaps and some added value. Meanwhile, Sheoldred's Edict is better if you need an instant speed version of it to interact with combos, for example, and thus instead of power creep, we have 2 powerful alternatives to one another. I guess the argument is that both of them got printed in the last couple of years, so we are still power creeping, even if one isn't an example of power creep of the other. Meanwhile, stock up is kind of best in class. So check your bulk. If you crack a lot of Aetherdrift packs and put your cards to the side, dig through them for some momentum breakers. They're not exactly expensive, but they are hugely playable in multiple formats. And stock up, which is currently sitting at a market average of $4 for an uncommon, which is very rare for a standard set. And weirdly, like Aetherdrift has been and gone at this point, right? Dragonstorm of Tarkir's spoilers started yesterday. The set will be out for pre-release 2 weeks from the recording of this video. And then we're just on to the rest of the year with Final Fantasy and Spider-Man and Edge of Eternities and Avatar. And thus, I don't see stock up seeing its price go down unless somehow it sees less play across these formats, or it shows up in another product down the line, which it could do. This could be just a de facto card we see quite often. The name is quite generic. It's not like I'm referencing anything particularly on Aetherdrift or any of the planes that Aetherdrift took place on as well, so it can be pretty elsewhere. I've been Vince, also known as PleasantKenobi on the internet. Don't forget to subscribe for more Magic content. If you buy anything mentioned in this video or buy anything Magic cards at all, go to coolstuffinc.com, use the code in the description, code Kenobi, at checkout to get 5% off your order. And if you're buying in Europe, go to magicmadhouse.co.uk. Again, use the code on screen now to get 5% off your order and help support the show. I'll see you in the next one. Ta-ta for now, dickheads.